My name is Elias Thorne. This is not a confession, nor is it a plea for help. It is simply a record, an attempt to impose a logical sequence upon events that defy all logic. Before my life narrowed to the hum of fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of floor cleaner, I was a man who dealt in order. I was an archival researcher, a custodian of forgotten histories. My days spent in the quiet, dust-moated halls of a university library. My world was one of cataloged facts and verifiable sources. Then the world shifted. Funding was cut, positions were eliminated, and my meticulously ordered life collapsed into a chaotic spiral of mounting debt and dwindling prospects. Desperation is a corrosive acid. It eats away at pride, at caution, at reason itself. It was in this state that I found the online job listing. Night clerk needed for 24/27 convenience store. Immediate start. Excellent compensation. The salary they offer was ludicrous, nearly double what a position of this nature should command. It was a glaring red flag, a siren's song luring ships onto the rocks, but my ship was already sinking. I sent my resume, expecting no reply. To my surprise, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Henderson called me the next day. The interview, if one could call it that, was a brief, gruff affair conducted over the phone. He asked no questions about my work history or my qualifications. His only concerns were my willingness to work the graveyard shift, midnight to 600 a.m., and my ability to start immediately. I agreed. Good, he grunted. The keys in your first paycheck are in an envelope under the counter. The day shift girl, Sarah, will show you the basics. Don't be late. The line went dead. My first shift began under a moonless sky. The store, named simply Corner Stop, was an island of stark, artificial light in a sea of suburban darkness. It sat on a quiet, forgotten road at the edge of town, a place where the neat rows of houses gave way to unkempt fields and skeletal trees. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the low, oppressive hum of the refrigerators and the buzzing of the overhead lights. The place was unnervingly clean, almost sterile. Every can was perfectly aligned. Every candy bar sat in its designated slot. Every surface gleamed under the unforgiving glare. It felt less like a place of commerce and more like a museum exhibit designed to look like a store, timeless and untouched. The isolation was absolute. In the first hour, not a single car passed by on the road outside. At 11:55 p.m., a young woman with tired eyes and a perpetually hunched posture unlocked the door and let me in. This was Sarah. Her handover was a masterclass in frantic efficiency. She pointed out the register, the stockroom, the public restroom. Her words were clipped, her movements jerky, as if she were spring, loaded and desperate to be released. She avoided my gaze, her eyes darting towards the clock on the wall. "It's easy," she said, her voice thin. "Just keep the place tidy. The real instructions, well, you'll find them." She paused, her hand on the door, and for the first time, she looked directly at me. The fear in her eyes was a raw, physical thing. "Just read the list, the one by the register. Follow it. Follow it exactly. Don't be a hero. Don't get clever." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone. Her small sedan peeling out of the parking with a squeal of tires that sounded like a cry of relief. Alone in the humming silence, I felt a prickle of unease. I walked behind the counter and found it a single sheet of yellowed, brittle-looking paper protected by a grimy layer of lamination. It was tucked beneath the cash register, just as she'd implied. The title, typed in an old, slightly uneven font, was stark in its simplicity. Rules for the Graveyard Shift. I pulled it out. My first thought was that it was a prank, an elaborate hazing ritual for the new employee. The rules were bizarre, a strange mix of the mundane and the utterly nonsensical. I read them over, a small, condescending smile on my face. Rule Instruction 1: all transactions must be completed in cash between 1200 a.m. and 500 a.m. The card reader is for day shift use only. 2: at exactly 3:15 a.m., brew a fresh pot of black coffee. Pour 1 cup and leave it on the far end of the counter. You will find exact payment for it by the door when you open at 1600 a.m. He does not like to be kept waiting. 3: do not under any circumstances go into the walk-in freezer after 200 a.m. Stock it before then. If you hear knocking from outside, ignore it. It will stop. 4: a man in an old-fashioned, dark raincoat will sometimes come in, regardless of the weather. He will not be looking for anything. Do not speak to him or make eye contact. He is just browsing. He will leave on his own. 5: if you hear a child giggling in the candy aisle, do not go looking for them. Turn up the volume on the store radio for 5 minutes. The music calms them. 6: if the payphone on the outside wall rings, answer it. A voice will ask for a name you do not know. Tell them you have the wrong number and hang up immediately. Do not engage further. 7: the lights in household, cleaning and household, will sometimes flicker in a pattern 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. This is a signal. Lock the main door immediately and retreat to the back office. Do not come out for 10 minutes, even if you hear the front door chime. It is not a customer. 8: clean any smudges or handprints off the glass doors as soon as you see them, especially the small ones. 9: never use the staff restroom at the back. Use the public one. We cannot guarantee your safety in the other. 10: if a woman with eyes that are too far apart asks for a pack of Starlight brand cigarettes, tell her you are all out. We have never stocked this brand. She will be disappointed but will understand. Do not offer her a substitute. I scoffed. It was absurd. He does not like to be kept waiting. The music calms them. It was the work of a bored predecessor with a flair for the dramatic. I, a man of logic and reason, would not be taken in by such childish ghost stories. I tossed the list back under the register and set about my duties, determined to treat this job like any other. I swept the floors, restocked a few shelves, and settled in behind the counter with a thick history book I'd brought from home. The hours crawled by in perfect, uninterrupted silence. As 300 a.m. came and went, my mind briefly turned to Rule 82. The coffee. I was tired, and the thought of wasting a pot of perfectly good coffee on a ghost story seemed foolish. I dismissed it and returned to my reading, losing myself in the political intrigues of 17th century Europe. At 3:20 a.m., the atmosphere in the store changed. It was not a sudden event. but a gradual curdling of the air. A profound cold began to seep out from the corners of the room. A damp, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The low hum of the refrigerators deepened, the frequency dropping until it felt less like a sound and more like a vibration in my bones. A low, guttural growl that resonated in my chest. I looked up from my book, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The neatly stacked bags of chips on the shelf across from me began to tremble. A soft, rustling sound that was utterly out of place in the stillness. Then I saw the shadow. It detached itself from the corner of my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement where none should be. When I tried to look directly at it, it was gone. But I was left with the distinct impression of something impossibly tall and thin, something that bent at angles a human body could not. The air grew thick, heavy with a palpable sense of malevolent disappointment. It was so suffocatingly present that I found it difficult to draw a full breath. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The Rule 82. He does not like to be kept waiting. My hands shook so violently that I could barely operate the coffee machine. I fumbled with the filter, spilled grounds on the counter, and nearly scalded myself with the hot water. The entire time, the low growl intensified, and the cold deepened until my teeth were chattering. Finally, the coffee was brewed. With a trembling hand, I poured a single cup of steaming, black liquid. I walked to the far end of the counter, my feet feeling like lead, and placed the mug down. The instant the ceramic touched the formica, the change was immediate. The oppressive cold receded as if a switch had been flipped. The guttural growl softened, rising in frequency until it was once again the familiar, innocuous hum of the refrigerators. The air cleared, losing its suffocating weight. The presence, the feeling of being watched with ancient and aggrieved eyes, vanished completely. I was left alone, drenched in a cold sweat, my body shaking with the aftershocks of a terror I could not begin to process. I stared at the cup of coffee, steam rising from it in the sterile light. It was not a prank. It was not a story. The rules were not suggestions or superstitions meant to spook the new guy. They were a set of operational procedures, a system of cause and effect governing interactions with forces that had no place in my ordered, rational world. I had failed to perform a simple task, and in doing so, I had breached a contract I didn't know I'd signed. The penalty had been immediate and terrifying. My role here was not merely to be a store clerk. I was a service provider, a functionary for a clientele that was not and had never been human. The true horror wasn't that the store was haunted. It was that the store was open for business, on a level I couldn't comprehend. I looked at the laminated list, which no longer seemed like a joke. It looked like the most important thing in the world. It looked like a survival manual, and I understood with a certainty that chilled me more than the supernatural cold had, that I was trapped. 6 weeks. 6 weeks have passed since that first night, and the man I was, the skeptical academic, the believer in a rational universe, is a ghost. In his place is a creature of ritual and vigilance. My life is now governed by that laminated list. It has become my scripture, my catechism of fear. My nights are a meticulous, nerve-shredding ballad of appeasement. Before 200 a.m., I stock the freezer, my hand checking the heavy latch 3, 4, 5 times. I keep the small, tinny radio behind the counter, tuned to a bland pop station. The volume knob always within arm's reach. I monitor the lights in aisle 4 with the intensity of an air traffic controller, watching for a plane to fall from the sky. The psychological erosion is the worst part. Sleep, when it comes during the day, is a shallow, unrestful affair, plagued by dreams of flickering lights and knocking from behind closed doors. Bright, cheerful world of sunlight feels alien, a reality to which I no longer belong. Conversations with the few people I still know feel trivial. Their concerns about traffic and weather impossibly distant from my nightly reality of appeasing unseen horrors. I have become a prisoner of the graveyard shift, isolated by a truth so outlandish that to speak would be to invite a diagnosis of insanity. So I remain silent, the fear coiling in my gut like a cold serpent. The customers from the list are no longer abstract concepts. They are regulars. The man in the raincoat was the first I encountered after the coffee incident. It was a clear, dry night, the stars sharp and cold in the sky, yet he entered as if walking out of a torrential downpour. His dark, old-fashioned raincoat was soaked, dripping small, dark puddles onto my immaculately clean floor. He moved with a slow, drifting gait, his head bowed so that his face was completely obscured by the shadow of his hat. Rule 5-4 screamed in my mind, "Do not speak to him or make eye contact." I grabbed a mop and began to vigorously clean a patch of already spotless linoleum near the register, my entire being focused on the task. His presence was a vacuum, sucking the warmth and sound from the immediate vicinity. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade. The air grew still and heavy. He drifted down the chip aisle, then back up the canned goods aisle, never once reaching for a product. After an eternity that lasted perhaps 3 minutes, he turned and left as silently as he had arrived. The moment the door closed behind him, the ambient sound of the store rushed back in, and I could breathe again. A week later, I heard it. A faint, tinkling sound from the far side of the store. Jiggling. A child's laughter, coming from the candy aisle. Every protective instinct, every fiber of my being, screamed at me to go and investigate. Was a child lost? Had someone left their kid behind? But Sarah's warning and the stark text of Rule 5 held me in place. Do not go looking for them. Turn up the volume on the store radio for 5 minutes. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. I cranked the volume, and a saccharine pop song blared through the tiny speakers, the sound feeling profane and jarring in the otherwise silent store. I couldn't hear the giggling over the music, but I felt it. I felt a sense of being watched with a playful, yet deeply predatory curiosity. It was the feeling of a cat watching a mouse, amused by its scurrying, knowing it could pounce at any moment. After exactly 5 minutes, I turned the radio down. The feeling was gone. The payphone was perhaps the most jarring. It's an ancient, disconnected relic bolted to the outside wall, a fossil from a bygone era. Its shrill, piercing ring ripped through the quiet of the store one night, making me jolt so hard I knocked over a display of chewing gum. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule Phase 6. Answer it. I walked to the door, my legs unsteady, and pushed it open. The ringing was deafeningly loud in the night air. I lifted the cold, heavy receiver to my ear. "Hello," I managed, my voice a croak. Static hissed on the line, thick and oily. Through it, a voice spoke. It was distorted, ancient, like the grinding of stones. It asked for a name that sounded like a cough and a whisper. Azrael. My blood ran cold. I forced the words out, a mantra of survival. "You have the wrong number." I slammed the receiver back into its cradle. As I did, I could have sworn I heard a faint, frustrated sigh from the earpiece. A sound that seemed to exist for a split second, after the connection should have been severed. These encounters became my new normal. But it was the woman who truly taught me the nature of my predicament. She arrived around 4:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was elegant, dressed in a simple but well-tailored dress, and she smiled pleasantly as the door chimed. But her face was wrong. Rule Fate 10 had been specific. A woman with eyes that are too far apart. It was a subtle distinction, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The geometry of her face was just slightly off, creating an uncanny valley effect that was deeply unsettling. She glided to the counter, her pleasant smile never wavering. Her voice was melodious, but with a strange, flat effect, as if she were reciting lines she had learned phonetically. "A pack of starlights, please," she said. My mind raced. I was exhausted, my brain fuzzy from hours of hyper-vigilance. The polite, automatic response of a service worker rose to my lips. "I'm sorry, we don't carry that brand. Can I get you something else? Perhaps Marlboros?" The words were halfway out of my mouth when Rule Fate flashed in my mind's eye like a bolt of lightning. "Do not offer her a substitute." I caught myself, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. The half-formed offer died in my throat. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry as dust, and corrected my course. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice strained. "We're all out." For a single, terrifying second, her mask of pleasantry disintegrated. The smile vanished, and her mouth twisted downwards into a snarl of such profound, cosmic hatred that it felt like a physical blow. Her eyes, already unsettlingly wide set, seemed to darken into black, empty pits. In that moment, the illusion of a polite woman shattered, and I saw what was looking out from behind her face. Something ancient, something predatory, something that despised me and my entire species with a passion that could unmake stars. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. The pleasant smile returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes now. "Oh, what a shame," she said, her sweet voice a horrifying counterpoint to the fury I had just witnessed. She turned and glided out of the store. I collapsed against the counter, my legs giving out from under me. I had almost made a fatal error. I realized, then, that the rules were not just a simple list of do's and don'ts for my safety. They were a complex system of social etiquette, a diplomatic protocol, for interacting with non-human intelligences. Offering a substitute was not just a mistake. It was a grievous insult, a breach of a code I could not comprehend. It might have been seen as an invitation to a different kind of transaction, or perhaps a display of ignorance worthy of annihilation. I was not a zookeeper. I was an ambassador, on the front lines of an invisible world, and my only diplomatic pouch was a single, laminated sheet of paper. Later that night, as the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky, I was cleaning under the counter, trying to keep my hands busy. My fingers brushed against something rough carved into the unfinished wood. Curious, I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. There, gouged into the particle board, were a series of frantic, overlapping scratches. It was a name, JSUBW, and below it, a desperate, terrifying message. ITSINTHE RAFLETO. Hey Smillaspis Delok. Ralph Forsadoro Oak. My head snapped up. I stared at the convex security mirror. Mounted above the register, its dark, curved surface reflecting a distorted version of the silent store. Rule 24 had kept me safe from the man in the raincoat by teaching me to avoid his gaze. But it had never said anything about his reflection. Jacob's warning implied a horrifying addendum. A loophole in a rule I thought I understood. It suggested the list was incomplete. Or worse, that it could be wrong. I stared at the dark, silent screen, a new and terrible fear taking root in my soul, dreading the next time the man in the dripping coat would come in to browse. Jacob's desperate message, carved like a final testament into the wood, changed everything. The passive, reactive terror that had defined my existence for weeks began to curdle into something else, a cold, focused need to understand. Survival was no longer enough. If the rules were flawed or incomplete, then simply following them was a fool's game. I had to learn the logic of the system I was trapped within. My shift was no longer a sentence to be endured. It became a field research opportunity in a laboratory of the damned. I began keeping a journal, a small, black notebook I kept hidden in my locker. In it, I documented everything. Timestamps, atmospheric changes, the precise nature of every anomalous event. I cross-referenced these occurrences with the 10 rules, searching for patterns, for connections, for the things Jacob might have seen that led to his frantic warning. My senses, already honed by fear, sharpened further. I began to notice the subtleties. The way the knocking from the freezer sometimes fell into a strange, syncopated rhythm. The way the static on the other end of the payphone line would sometimes resolve, for a fraction of a second, into what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't know. I began to cautiously, carefully, probe the boundaries of my confinement. I never broke a rule, not after the coffee incident, but I tested their edges. I still refused to open the walk in freezer after 200 a.m., but I started pressing my ear against the cold, vibrating steel door when the knocking began. It wasn't random. It was a code. I was sure of it, though one I couldn't decipher. Then one night, amidst the rhythmic thuds, I heard something new. A voice, a dry, faint whisper that seemed to come from inches away on the other side of the metal. It whispered my name. Elias. When the man in the raincoat next appeared as dark form, dripping on another clear night. I was ready, remembering Jacob's warning. I forced myself to ignore the man himself, busying my hands with wiping down the counter. But this time, my eyes were fixed on the black and white security monitor above my head. I positioned myself at an angle where I could watch his progress without turning my head. In the grainy feed, I saw his reflection move down ISO 3. He was just as I remembered, head down, funereal pace. But then, as he passed from the camera's view, his reflection did not. The figure on the screen stopped. It stood perfectly still for a moment, and then its head craned upwards at an unnatural angle, looking directly into the security camera, directly at me, and it smiled. It was a grin that stretched its face far beyond human limits, a wide, predatory slash filled with far too many teeth. A cold, liquid dread poured through my veins. Rule 24 had kept me safe from the entity in the coat, but it had left me utterly exposed to the thing that watched through its reflection. The true revelation, however, was yet to come. It arrived on a Thursday, heralded by the lights in ISO 4. They began to flicker in their familiar, dreaded pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. As I had done half a dozen times before, I moved to the front door, my hand reaching for the deadbolt. But tonight, Jacob's ghost and the smiling reflection were fresh in my mind. Hiding was no longer enough. I needed to see. I locked the door and retreated to the back office as instructed. But instead of cowering in the corner and counting the seconds, I went to the small, grimy window that looked out onto the store floor. It had always been blocked by a stack of old inventory boxes. But earlier in my shift, driven by this new, desperate curiosity, I had moved them. Heart pounding, I peered through the dirty glass. The store looked wrong. The air was shimmering, distorted, like the heat haze rising from asphalt on a summer day. The familiar rows of products seemed to waver and bend at the edges. Through this strange distortion, I heard the front door chime, a sound that was impossible, as I had locked it myself. A figure stepped through the shimmering veil where the door was. It was not a customer. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and jointed like an insect's. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait that was both fluid and broken. It paid no attention to me or the office. It moved with purpose directly to ISL 4, the source of the flickering signal. It did not browse the shelves of bleach and detergent. Instead, it reached out a long, multi-jointed arm and phased it directly into the shelf, its form passing through the plastic bottles as if they were smoke. When it pulled its arm back, it was no longer empty. It was holding a small, pulsating orb of what looked like captured night. A sphere of roiling, dark light that seemed to drink the fluorescence from the air around it. The creature held the orb up, inspecting it for a moment with a tilt of its featureless head. It seemed to nod in satisfaction. Then, it turned, walked back to the front of the store, and exited through the shimmering distortion. The door chimed again. The heat haze effect vanished, and the lights in AZL 4 returned to their steady, normal glow. I stumbled back from the window, the gasping for air. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This store was not just a haunted way station. It was a place of business, a transactional hub, a supernatural black market. The flickering lights were not a warning of a random monster loose in the aisles. They were a service notification, a signal that a pickup was scheduled. My role in locking the door and hiding was not for my safety from the creature. It was to ensure that I did not witness or, worse, interfere with the transaction. The physical store, with its mundane products, was a facade, a cover for a different kind of inventory stored in the spaces between realities. The high pay wasn't danger money. It was hush money. It was payment for my complicity in a system I could not begin to fathom. The moment I understood the purpose of this place, the point of no return was crossed. The system, it seemed, knew that I knew. The phenomena in the store shifted, becoming more personal, more pointedly directed at me. The whispers from the freezer no longer just said my name. They began to repeat phrases I had muttered to myself under my breath earlier in the shift. The child's giggling from the candy aisle was one night replaced by a perfect, chilling imitation of my late mother's laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in a decade. The trap was closing. In a fit of desperate panic, I used my cell phone to call the number for Mr. Henderson. A recorded voice informed me that the number had been disconnected. I looked up the parent company listed on my pay stub, Henderson Holdings LLC. It didn't exist. I drove to the corporate address provided. It was an overgrown, empty lot between a laundromat and a pawn shop. There was no one to quit to. There was no escape. This wasn't a job you could leave. I was no longer just an employee. I was a component, a cog in the store's horrifying machinery. That night, as I stood defeated behind the counter, my eyes fell upon the laminated list. My blood turned to ice. At the bottom of the typed list, below Rule Fate 10, was a new line, written in what looked like fresh, black ink. The handwriting was a neat, sharp cursive. 11. Stop asking questions. We are listening. The night it all came to end began with a storm. It wasn't just a storm. It was a biblical deluge, a violent tantrum of nature that hammered against the store's plate glass windows and shook the building to its foundations. While cleaning out an old filing cabinet in the back office earlier that week, I had found a dusty logbook. In it, a brief entry from a year ago to the day, storm tonight. JW didn't show for his shift. Jacob. This was the anniversary of his disappearance. A cold sense of foreboding settled over me. The storm seemed to act as a catalyst, an accelerant for the store's malevolent energies. The fragile system of rules I had so carefully maintained began to break down. It started with the lights in ISIL 4, their SOS flicker struggling to be seen against the strobing flashes of lightning outside. As I was locking the front door, the payphone on the wall began to ring, its shrill cry barely audible over the thunder. Before I could even decide which rule to prioritize, I heard it. Faint giggling from the candy aisle, interwoven with the rhythmic, insistent knocking from the walk-in freezer. It was a chaotic symphony of my deepest fears. I was overwhelmed, a panicked juggler, trying to keep a dozen spinning plates from crashing down. I retreated to the office for the ISL-4 protocol, my ears straining to hear the chime of the phantom customer over the ringing phone and the storm's fury. The 10 minutes felt like an hour. When I emerged, the phone had stopped ringing, but the knocking and giggling persisted. The entire store felt charged, vibrating with a hostile energy that was escalating toward some terrible crescendo. It was then that I found Jacob's final message. In a moment of sheer desperation, I broke one of my own unwritten rules and entered the forbidden staff restroom at the back, thinking I could splash water on my face. The place was cold, rank with the smell of mildew. And there, scratched into the porcelain back of the toilet cistern, was his last, desperate warning. THRE, ISON and more, HEMAKCOURC off, THEO off, TE sto om. As I read the words, the lights in the store flickered violently. They buzzed, dimmed, and then, with a final, pathetic pop, died. The emergency generator in the back, which I tested weekly, sputtered for a moment and then fell silent. I was plunged into absolute darkness, a blackness so complete it felt physical. The humming of the refrigerators, the buzzing of the lights, the knocking from the freezer, the giggling from the ISIL. It all ceased. The only sound was the roar of the storm outside. And then, a new sound began. Soft, polite, a gentle tap, tapping on the front glass door. My blood ran cold. I crept from the restroom, my hands outstretched in the suffocating dark, and peered toward the front of the store. Through the rain-streaked glass, illuminated only by a flash of lightning, I saw a silhouette. The tapping was joined by a voice, and my heart seized in my chest. It was Sarah, the day shift girl. Elias. "Oh God, Elias, let me in," she cried, her voice filled with convincing panic. My car broke down just up the road. "The storm is getting worse, please." Jacob's warning echoed in my mind. He makes you write it yourself. This was it. The final exam. A scenario for which there was no rule on the list. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that the person at the door was not Sarah. The entities were using my memories, my fears, my sliver of hope for human contact, as a weapon against me. I stayed frozen, my back pressed against a cold metal shelf. The pleading grew more desperate. "Elias, please. I'm scared." Then the voice shifted, melting into a sound that broke my heart. It was my mother's voice. "Eli, honey, it's Mom. Open the door, baby. It's so cold out here." Tears streamed down my face, but I did not move. This was the test, the lock-in. The polite tapping escalated into furious pounding that shook the entire storefront, the glass groaning in its frame. The voices shifted again, becoming a chorus of everyone I had ever known, pleading, begging, and then, finally, turning to threats, snarling my name with a venom that was utterly inhuman. I retreated to the back office, huddled on the floor, and covered my ears, reciting the rules over and over like a prayer. Rule 1 cash only. Rule 2 I've coffee at 3:15. Rule 30 ignore the knocking. I don't know how long I stayed there, lost in a fugue state of terror. But eventually, I noticed a change. The relentless pounding had ceased. The cacophony of voices had fallen silent. A thin, gray light was filtering through the grimy office window. Dawn. As the first rays of the rising sun pierced the clouds, the emergency lights in the store flickered on with a hum, casting a pale, sickly glow over everything. The storm had passed. Shaking, I forced myself to my feet and emerged from the office. The store was a wreck. Products were strewn across the aisles, knocked from their shelves by the violent vibrations. But on the counter, in a space that was perfectly clean and untouched, sat 3 items that had not been there before. A single, pristine sheet of blank paper, a simple, black fountain pen, and next to them, a small, tarnished silver locket. I walked towards it, a strange, hollow clarity replacing the terror. I understood. The ultimate role of the night clerk was not just to manage the store, but to chronicle it, to expand its scripture. When an employee survived a new, uncatalogued event, they were compelled to create a new rule for their successor, adding to the store's institutional, operational memory. Jacob had failed his test. He had failed to write his rule, and he had paid the price. I had survived. This was my reward. My promotion. I was no longer just following the rules. I was creating them. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up the pen. The fear was gone, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. I knew what I had to write. 12. If the main power fails during a storm, and the emergency generator does not engage, this is a lock-in event. Do not approach the doors or windows. The voices you hear are not real. They are a test of your resolve. Barricade the door if necessary. Survive until dawn. Your reward for doing so will be waiting on the counter. I set the pen down. I picked up the silver locket. It felt cold in my hand. On a strange impulse, I took it to the inventory scanner. I held it under the red light, and the machine beeped. The small screen on the register lit up with green text. Item 27 and 34. Memento of a lost voice. Price NTA. I carefully slid the new, handwritten rule under the plastic lamination, placing it at the bottom of the list. Then I walked to the front of the store and began to methodically pick up the fallen items, restoring order. I looked at my own reflection in the dark security monitor above the register. For the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the floor. In the distance, I heard the familiar rumble of Sarah's car pulling into the parking lot to begin the day's shift. My shift was over. I was tired, but it was a calm, settled exhaustion. I knew I would be back tonight, and the night after that, and every night for the foreseeable future. I was no longer a victim of this place. I was its custodian. I was the keeper of the rules. I was home.